In the summer of 1974, one man fell from the sky into a forest that had never been meant for humans. Richard Knight should have died on impact, yet he didn't. How does a pilot survive a high-speed crash deep in the wilderness with no radio, no supplies, and no hope of rescue? For 48 hours, he would lie there, alone, before the real fight even began. One broken leg, a fractured rib, and a forest closing in like a living trap. What kind of will does it take to crawl out of your own coffin and decide to keep breathing? Richard Knight was just 34 years old, an experienced pilot who had flown hundreds of hours over these same mountains. Now he was nothing more than prey. How long could one man last when the only way out was to walk? But to understand how Richard Knight ended up fighting for his life in that unforgiving forest, we must go back to the ordinary days before the sky betrayed him. Richard was the kind of man who lived for the air. A former Air Force pilot turned civilian ferry pilot. He took on short-haul delivery runs that most others avoided. Medical supplies, urgent mail, the occasional charter into remote logging camps. On July 12, 1974, Richard accepted what should have been a routine 3-hour ferry flight to deliver critical medical equipment to a remote lumber town deep in the Cascade foothills. The forecast called for scattered thunderstorms, but nothing unusual for midsummer. Richard had flown this corridor dozens of times. He kissed Emily goodbye that morning without a second thought. Family was everything to him. Emily worried about the long hours, but she trusted his skill. Tommy dreamed of becoming a pilot just like his dad. Everything checked out. Fuel was topped off. The medical crates were securely lashed in the rear cabin. Richard climbed into the cockpit, feeling the familiar thrill of another day in the sky. At 10:47 a.m., Richard Knight lifted off on what he believed would be just another routine flight. The engine hummed perfectly. The horizon stretched ahead. No one on the ground could have imagined what was coming. For the first hour, everything was textbook. Then the sky began to change. Scattered thunderstorms were expected, but these cells were growing faster than forecast. Richard radioed Portland Approach for a weather update and received clearance to climb to 10,000 feet. The plane was still responding well. Richard had flown through worse. He trusted his machine and his instincts. Then came the first warning sign, an unusual vibration in the engine that no checklist had prepared him for. He was still confident he could ride it out. But the forest below was waiting, silent and vast. At 11:32 a.m., the engine coughed once, then twice. Richard immediately began troubleshooting, but the problem was deeper than he knew. He declared an emergency. The last transmission was calm. Cessna 172 November, 4729, Golf engine failure, attempting forced landing. There was no clearing. Only trees, thousands upon thousands of them, standing like silent sentinels. The crash itself lasted less than 8 seconds. But the silence that followed would stretch into days. When Richard regained consciousness, the first thing he felt was the cold rain on his face and the crushing weight of the wreckage pinning him in place. His left leg was broken in 2 places. A rib had punctured his lung, yet the will to live was already kicking in. It took him nearly 2 hours to crawl clear of the wreckage. Every movement sent fire through his body, but he refused to stop. No radio, no survival kit beyond what was in his jacket pockets. Just a pocketknife, a half-empty pack of cigarettes, and a small compass. The first night was the longest. Pain kept him awake. Every snap of a twig made him wonder what was out there watching him. He knew rescue would take days, maybe weeks. The only choice was to move, toward the nearest road, the nearest river, the nearest chance. Each step was agony, but stopping meant dying. Richard Knight began the longest walk of his life. Water was plentiful, food was not. He had already gone 24 hours without eating. Small victories kept him going. A handful of berries, a moment of shelter. The compass needle that still pointed the way. The second night brought fever. Infection was setting in, yet Richard Knight refused to let the forest win. By the morning of the third day, fever had taken hold, but Richard Knight pushed on, driven by the image of his wife Emily and son Tommy waiting back in Portland. Navigation was his only advantage. The compass and the sun, when it broke through, gave him direction, but every mile felt like 10 in his broken condition. Food remained scarce, but these small gifts from the forest kept his strength from completely failing. He rationed every berry, knowing he needed every calorie to keep moving. The rain that had helped him find water now made travel even more treacherous, turning slopes into slippery hazards for a man with only one good leg. Rivers and streams became both lifeline and obstacle. He followed them whenever possible, knowing they often led towards civilization, but crossing them with his injuries tested his limits. Infection was spreading. The break was compound, and without antibiotics, Richard knew time was running out. Yet he refused to panic, focusing instead on the next step, the next hour. Each night brought new doubts. Would search planes ever spot the wreckage through the thick canopy? Would rescuers even know where to look? 4 days in, Richard had covered perhaps 4 miles at most. His body was weakening, but his mind remained sharp, calculating every decision with the precision of a pilot. He remembered survival training from his Air Force days. Knowing which plants were safe kept him from poisoning himself in his desperate search for sustenance. Falls were constant threats. One bad slip could end everything, but Richard adapted, turning pain into fuel for his next careful movement. The storms that had caused his crash now tested him further, but the cave offered rare protection and a chance to rest his battered body. Fire was a luxury he hadn't had since the crash. The warmth eased his pain slightly and gave him the first real moment of comfort in days. He began keeping a mental log, just as he would in a flight journal. Day 4, position unknown, condition deteriorating but spirit intact. 5 days alone in the wilderness. Search efforts had surely begun by now, but Richard couldn't wait to be found. He had to keep moving toward any sign of rescue. Crossing deeper water was one of the greatest risks, but the river offered the best chance of leading him out of the endless trees. The river fought him every inch, but Richard emerged on the other side stronger in will, even as his body grew weaker. This was the first real sign of human presence in days. An old logging road meant people had been here before. It renewed his hope like nothing else. Small things became monumental victories: a trail, a handful of food, a moment without blinding pain. Richard clung to them all. Hope was returning. If he could follow this trail long enough, it might lead to a road, a camp, or at least a place where search planes could spot him more easily. Thoughts of family kept the darkness at bay. Richard promised himself he would see them again, no matter what the forest demanded of him. 6 days after the crash, Richard Knight was no longer just surviving. He was methodically working his way back toward the world he had left behind. The first search plane passed somewhere above, but the forest hid him too well. Still, the sound alone gave him strength to push harder. The search was underway. Richard knew he had to make himself as visible as possible, even if it meant risking more energy on open stretches. These artifacts from other humans reminded him he wasn't the first to challenge this wilderness, and he wouldn't be the last to walk out of it. Fire and visibility became his new priorities. If the search planes returned, he wanted them to have any possible chance of spotting smoke or movement. He began to believe he might actually make it. The trail was leading somewhere, and his body, though battered, was still obeying his will. 7 days, 1 week since the sky had tried to claim him. Richard Knight was still walking, still fighting, still refusing to become another lost soul in the forest. The camp was long deserted, but it offered shelter, possible tools, and a much better chance of being seen from the air. For the first time, Richard allowed himself to feel real optimism. In that forgotten logging camp, after 7 grueling days, Richard Knight had crossed the threshold from victim to survivor. But the fight was far from over. Help was still days away, and the forest still held him in its grip. On the morning of the 8th day, Richard Knight heard the unmistakable thump of rotor blades cutting through the air. For the first time in over a week, rescue was no longer a distant dream. The rescuers could hardly believe their eyes when they spotted the gaunt figure waving from the abandoned camp. After 7 long days of searching, they had finally found Richard Knight alive. As the helicopter lifted him away from the forest that had nearly claimed him, Richard allowed himself to close his eyes for the first time in days. He was going home. When Richard finally saw Emily and Tommy walking through the hospital door, the pain of the past 8 days melted away. The family he had fought so hard to return to was finally in his arms again. Richard Knight had survived what few could. He crawled out of a burning wreck, walked through miles of unforgiving wilderness, and refused to let the forest win. 8 days after his plane fell from the sky, he was finally home, alive, reunited, and forever changed. His story remains one of the most remarkable tales of survival in modern aviation history.